Okay, now I'm gonna open it. Just
Do I read
to
the
let
whole
people-
thing? What do you say? Yeah, it's okay.
I think you can pick a few sentences there. I don't think you need the whole thing.
All right. Okay.
Just to give a general overview.
Mhm.
Oh, here he is. Hello.
Oh,
Hi. Nice
hi.
to meet you.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming.
An honor and pleasure. Honor and pleasure. So are we on for is this about an hour or is it 40 minutes? 45? Yeah. How is it?
Well, you can talk for about 40, 45 minutes if that works, and then we open it up for questions and answers.
Okay.
All microphones and cameras will be off until questions and answers, so it's all eyes on you unless you want some kind of interaction at some point.
Okay. No good. All good.
They often have a lot of questions in these sessions.
Okay,
It's
that's
really
okay.
good. They're really, the people who come are really, they're searchers, they have good questions. They often know a lot. So it's a great forum.
Lovely.
Yeah.
So, Professor Perellis, what are you professor of?
Sephardic Studies at the Bernard Revel Graduate School,
Oh, wonderful.
Yeshiva University.
Wonderful.
I focus on post-expulsion Sephardim, and specifically the westward, so the Americas and Inquisition and things like that. So Amsterdam, London, connect.
Well, so you're going to have to give me your views on my thoughts here. Because right around
Well,
all
there
that,
are
like
co-sponsors
separating
for this whole
from-
series. There are co-sponsors, so
Love it.
that's
Love it.
Yeah. So
I would
it's
be very
nice.
interested. I would be very interested in your thoughts around you.
Well, likewise.
What I'll share,
Likewise. Good
because
conversation.
what I'm sharing is essentially my experience, right? I'm not saying it necessarily from an academic point of view, but I'm looking at it from my experience being here in the Kahal and my knowledge of being also a Syrian Jew and how those things have manifested. So thoughts that I'll share from observation essentially, but I'm interested in your thoughts. Yeah.
Right. Well, just on Monday we had Professor Matt Goldish, and one of the great things that he points out is the culture shock between
Yes.
Chachamim who come from North Africa or
Yes.
from Turkey,
I'm
and
going
they
to speak
show
about
up and they're like, "Wait, what's going on here? Who
What's
are these
happening?"
people?"
Exactly.
I thought, whatever happened to Kavod Chachamim? So
Absolutely.
it's not a new phenomenon. At the same time, things are different. Obviously, every time period has its own special, right?
True. Yeah.
Right. So this is really very exciting. And
how often does this occur? Do you do this every week, or is this how often are these talks?
I guess it depends what this is, but
right.
Well,
that's the question.
Right. These talks, are they regular, or are they specific to occasions?
So because we're the American Sephardi Federation, we
Mhm.
cover everything pretty much. So right now we're in the middle of 2 weeks of Global Nacao. So we're talking really about Western Sephardim. We had a Tu B'Shvat Western Sephardim, Tisha B'Av Western Sephardim. I mean, we focus on that. But we usually, like now we have 3 a week for these 2 weeks. Usually it'll be somewhere between 2 and 3 a week.
How lovely.
We
well,
have
the honor to take part. Thank you for having me, really.
Well, and we're hoping you're going to take part in our live conference next year.
With God,
New York.
I look forward to that. That would be lovely.
Yeah.
How nice it would be to get back to such things.
Right?
Yes.
Right?
So much, yeah.
How is it in London?
It's good. It's good. I mean, we're easing out of lockdown here, so gradually. But we've been able to hold services for a while. And at Lauderdale Road, we have Bevis Marks just opened last weekend, last Shabbat. But it's been challenging, as with everyone, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Hoping that people get used to coming back to synagogue.
That's a big challenge, right? That's what everyone's talking about.
Right. So that's the question.
And coming back different, maybe, right? That's
yes.
awesome.
Well, it is a big question. We haven't been wearing our top hats for a long time and wondering if that's going to come back. But But yeah,
It doesn't get in the way of a mask. I mean, you can wear it.
Well, no, it's true. But the reason we haven't is because we didn't want people going into their cubbies and pulling them out and going all over. We wanted people to kind of be very in and out. Unfortunately, we haven't had choir, which we missed tremendously. Yeah, it's been an interesting experience. Yeah.
So I'm gonna kind of get us started just a little bit. So first of all, I love that we have people from many different places, although only a few people posted. I'd love to see some more. We have from Rhodes in New York City, and Vancouver, and Yucatan. And Israel. Well, I'm from Israel too, but so I love to see it. So if you put it into the chat, it just makes it a little more homey, makes us feel a little closer to each other. So hold on, sorry. So a little bit of logistics at the beginning. All the attendees, microphones and cameras will be off. We'll allow Rabbi Dweck to give his presentation formally. And then at the end, we will have more of a discussion and questions and answers. We'll open up we'll allow you to open your cameras and microphones, and we do encourage everybody to do that. However, if you have something pressing that needs to be said, and we do encourage that as well, I understand from Rabbi Dweck that would be okay. Please throw it into the chat, throw it into the Q&A. I think between the three of us, we'll definitely be monitoring them. So please do that. Again, everybody, please throw where you're from there. I want to say thank you again to the Schneer Center, the International Center from Yeshiva University for co-sponsoring these talks with us, and welcome from the American Sephardi Federation Institute of Jewish Experience. We have to shorten that somehow, but we do thank everyone for coming, and I love to see our regulars here. So we look forward to it. I will pass it over to Professor Perillis.
Thank you, Drora, and thank you for your vision and your energy in getting this wonderful series together, and really, this entire year there's such sharing of this scholarship, the latest idea in the Sephardic world, and it's been happening here, and we've been sharing it with this global community. And that's why the idea of a global Nacao conference is so dear to my heart, and the vision at the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program in International Affairs at Yeshiva University that I'm the director of. And this vision, the idea that people can connect across borders, that people can share culture and ideas and goods and movement throughout the world, and that makes us makes for a better world and a better society, and that in particular the Western Sephardim were modeling this for hundreds of years. And so for that reason, I'm particularly honored and excited by this mini Global Nacao conference, and we hope to have a in-person one in due time in New York. And so this is really great, but this is going to be the beginning of conversations and that we look forward to having. So I want to, and I want to just say it's a real honor to introduce Rabbi Dweck. And there's a reason why we're here today. It's because you've heard about him, not only because of his topic, but he is a person who is dedicated to ideas and dedicated to the Kehillah. And so we're very, very excited to have you here. I want to just briefly introduce you in a formal way, just to say that Rabbi Joseph Dweck is the senior rabbi of the S&P Sephardi community of the United Kingdom. He's an American-born rabbi who's lived in Los Angeles and Brooklyn. He studied in Jerusalem at the Yeshiva Hazon Ovadia under the tutelage of former Sephardi chief rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Also studied psychology and philosophy at Santa Monica College in California, among other degrees. His smicha is from Maran Ovadia Yosef, and he received the Master of Arts degree in Jewish education. Rabbi Dweck also served as rabbi of Congregation Sharei Shalom, a Syrian Sephardi synagogue of over 700 members in Brooklyn from 1999 to 2014. Also served as headmaster of the Barkai Yeshiva, a large Jewish day school in Brooklyn from 2010 to 2014. He has eclectic taste in music. I'm excited to hear a little bit more about that at some point. And has received training as a Hazan in the Oriental Sephardi tradition by Rabbi Raphael El Nadav, Zichrono Livracha, and Cantor Moshe Habusha. In his capacity as senior rabbi, Rabbi Dweck has the honor of being the deputy president of the LSJS, a president of the Council of Christians and Jews, and ecclesiastical authority of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. The British know how to have these very, very impressive sounding committees and titles, something that American Jews can maybe learn from. Rabbi Dweck also serves as a member of the Standing Committee of the Conference of European Rabbis, and currently Rabbi Dweck lives in London with his wife Margalit and their 5 children. And without any further ado, I turn it over to Rabbi Dweck, and I'm excited to hear some new ideas and for the discussion that follows. Please send your questions into the chat, and we'll have time for sure for responses and discussion, and we look forward to that. So thank you very much. Baruch haba.
Professor Perlis, thank you so much for the lovely welcome and the lovely introduction. I want to thank you. I want to thank the American Sephardi Federation for welcoming me here at the Nacao conference. It's an honor to be here and to contribute. I don't know that the ideas that I will share will be new to you at all, but I look forward to being able to share them with you and with the people who are here. I wish everyone a good Wednesday. I've stopped saying good afternoon, good morning, good evening, because it's different times all over the place. So a good Wednesday to everyone. I'm going to say right at the beginning that the thoughts that I'd like to share with you are essentially my thoughts. They are thoughts that are from my own observations and understandings of how it is that the Western Sephardim have been unique in the Jewish world, and what it is that perhaps we can learn from the way that the Western Sephardim have engaged in their Judaism and in the world in general. I think, for many people, the Western Sephardim, I recognize that the group that I'm speaking to now understand what I mean when I say Western Sephardim. But for a good many people, it is something that is a bit of an anomaly, because when we say in general Sephardim, to people, more likely than not, people are thinking Middle Eastern, North Africa, right? They're thinking Arabic, they're thinking Moroccan, Syrian, Egyptian, Lebanese. They're not thinking English usually when we say Sephardim. They're not thinking Dutch when we say that. And so I think for the most part, that's something for us to be able to recognize, that the term Sephardi as it is used today has become so broad that we kind of lose a sense of the tremendous nuance that is properly involved in that term. Of course, the word itself, at its core, at its most basic meaning, means Spaniard, right? Because Sfarad is the term that we use in Hebrew for Spain, and has been used for Spain for hundreds of years. And a Sfaradi, in its basic sense, simply means a Spaniard. It's interesting, I mentioned that, Harambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimonides, he never stopped really signing his name, HaSefaradi. He would sign his name, Moshe ben Maimon HaSefaradi, various times. And that was even after he left Spain. But for some reason, there was something about Spanish Torah, the Spanish schools of Torah, that he felt were very special and that he always wanted to be connected to, even though he had to leave Spain as a result of a change in political climate that made it very uncomfortable for the Jewish people to stay where he was in the Andalusia in the south. But it is interesting that today we will use that term as a blanket term. And although the technical term for many of the Middle Eastern communities of Jews is not Sfaradim, but Ardot HaMizrach. That simply means they're the congregations of the East. And it is also true that in those congregations, I'll speak about mine, for example. My ancestral congregation of most recent past is the Syrian community that lived in Aleppo, in the city of Aleppo. It's unfortunate there's not much left of the city of Aleppo anymore. but my family lived, both on my mother and father's side, lived in Aleppo for roughly the last 500 years. Before that, both sides are Spanish. And it's interesting, one of the ways that we know the Aleppian Jews know that they have Spanish ancestry, or at least when I say no, I mean loosely, is because there is a special custom that the Spanish Jews kept when they came to Aleppo, and that is that on Hanukkah, the Spanish Jews of Aleppo light an extra ner, an extra light, separately from the rest of the Nerot Hanukkah every single night. And they do that as an expression of thanks, because they arrived on safe shores close to the time of Hanukkah. So on Hanukkah, they light an extra candle. And there are families in the Syrian community that do not do that. And there are families in the Syrian community that do that. And the families that do are generally understood to be the Spanish families. So both sides of my family, the Paredes family and the Dweck family, both light those candles. But there are definitely families that do not do that. And so there were always two communities in Aleppo. There was the Sephardi communities, the Spanish communities of the Spanish Jews that came to Aleppo after the expulsion, and there was the Mustarab, the indigenous Syrian Jews that were probably there from the time of David HaMelech, give or take. And so it's interesting that, and this was essentially the case in so much of the Mediterranean basin, because after the expulsion in 1492, the Jews of Spain moved. Many of them moved just to Portugal because it was still okay over there, but many of them moved throughout the Mediterranean basin. And there was this influx of Spanish Jews who came into these various communities of the Middle East. And today, the interesting thing is that they were so powerful in terms of their culture, in terms of their minhag, in terms of their thought, in terms of their approach to Judaism, that today we simply use Sephardi, the Spaniards, as a basic term, as a blanket term for all of those communities, right? So it's not technical, but it is very interesting that in the colloquial mode of speaking, we just call everybody Spaniards. And that says something about the very strong impact that the Spanish Jews had on those communities and on their mode of Judaism in general. I think that if we are to think about it, right, that's essentially how it is that we think about Sephardim. And as I said at the beginning, we don't really think about the fact that some of those Spanish Jews didn't move all throughout the Mediterranean basin. There were some of them who stayed in the West. Some of them went to Portugal, and then Portugal, there was an Inquisition that happened later, and there was a movement from Spain, Portugal, to Amsterdam, England, and that means that those Sephardim, those Spaniards, all were, that's essentially the Iberian Peninsula Jews, right, forever stayed in the West. They didn't really move to the East. And so it's interesting, when we moved here, my wife Margalit and I, Margalit is also a Middle Eastern Jew. Her family is both Syrian and Iraqi. And when we came here to London, and I took the position as senior rabbi, we walked in synagogue, and she felt very uncomfortable. And the reason she felt uncomfortable, we walked out afterwards, and she said, I feel like I'm in church. And she said the reason she feels like she's in church because there was this beautiful choir singing, but the songs that they were singing, the tunes that they were singing, were not Middle Eastern tunes. And just to say, what does it mean, Middle Eastern tunes? There were no half note, there were no quarter notes in any of the music, right? So much of Middle Eastern music, if those who are familiar with Middle Eastern music know that the tonal scales, or what they call the makamat, the makam, are made up of not only whole and half notes, but quarter notes. So, you have a piano, you have the white and black keys. The black key is a half note up. There are notes in between the white and black keys. The piano doesn't play, but nonetheless are played in Middle Eastern music. And that's what gives Middle Eastern music its flavor. And Margalit is very used to hearing that, as I'm very used to hearing that. And as Professor Perelis mentioned, I studied that music because it's very much part of Middle Eastern prayer and Middle Eastern services. The Syrian Jews have a different tonal scale that they use and pray in every single Shabbat. And so that was part of my study, that I had to learn the different tonal scales and how it is that, and what modes we sing in on each Shabbat, all having to do with either the Shabbat or the parasha that we read. And so when Margalit's very used to that, and I'm very used to it, but I knew what I was getting, I knew what I was coming into. Margalit was a bit shocked, and she said it sounds like church. As a matter of fact, the Spanish Portuguese services are very much high church. Yeah, they model the song, the mode of prayer and the mode of service after, English high church. And so what I said to Margalit when she said this, she said, it sounds like I'm in church. I said, yeah, it's because you're used to being in a mosque. And that's the reality. That's the truth. So it's important for us to recognize that these things that we tend to think, what is a Sephardi? What do Sephardim sound like? What do Sephardim speak like? We very often don't take into account the Western Sephardim, the Sephardim of Amsterdam, the Sephardim of England and other adjacent places. So in England, so I'm going to talk about that in a minute, what's going on in England, what happened in England. But it is important to recognize that there were Sephardim that just stayed in the West the entire time and didn't have this experience of moving to the East and experiencing life in the East. And that means that although they came from Spain, and even in Spain, there were different communities and there are different modes of thought. The Andalusian Sfaradim were not the same as the Catalonian Sfaradim. There were different approaches to Judaism, different approaches to Torah. But one thing that was pretty much ubiquitous, or that was pretty much the nature of Jewish life in Spain, is that the Jewish people didn't really live in ghettos. They didn't live in isolation from the society in which they lived. And even though the Spaniards and the Portuguese Jews that were moving, into Amsterdam and England were conversos for the most part, they were pretending that they were Christian in order to be able to survive in their territories. It still did not mean that they did not engage with the society. To the contrary, they were quite engaged with the society. They were pretending that they were blending perfectly with the society. But even whether we were doing it as conversos or we were doing it as, clear Jews, depending on what was the regime, was it Christian Spain, was it Muslim Spain, what was going on, what was there was that the Jewish people in Spain lived in the societies and engaged in the societies around them with the Gentiles that they lived with. And that made an impact on the Jewish mind. I visited a few years ago Cordoba and Malaga, Granada, and what they've done for tourists is they've tried to demark, or to delineate where the Jewish people lived as though there was this Jewish area. And it's very hard to do that. There was no real Jewish area or a ghetto of Jews in those areas. The Jews lived among the Gentiles. And that means also that they interacted and thought in terms of interaction rather than in terms of isolation. We see that also in terms of how it is that our Hachamim, our Spanish Hachamim, wrote. Our Spanish Hachamim wrote very often in the vernacular. They wrote in the Hebrew, in the Judeo-Arabic that was spoken in the Andalusia at the time, and you don't find that happening among the Ashkenazi Jews. The Ashkenazi Jews, for the most part, until almost Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in the 19th century, were writing in Hebrew only, or in Yiddish, but they were not writing in the vernacular. And there are many examples of that, in which the nature of the Spanish Portuguese way of life was very much integrated with the society around them. Again, in various modes, but nonetheless integrated. And that had a very strong effect on the Sephardi mind. And so when we think about that, and we look at the difference between East and West, specifically Eastern Sephardim and Western Sephardim, at around the time of the Enlightenment, there's a marked difference. And I will say, I have been attacked. Well, I shouldn't say attacked. I've been strongly challenged for saying this, because I have said more than once that I do think that around the time of the Enlightenment, there was a massive barrier or a massive difference between the Jews of the East and the Jews of the West. And that mainly is because, for all intents and purposes, the Enlightenment did not touch the Middle Eastern Jews in the way that it touched the Jews in the West. Now, of course, the Enlightenment touched and had effect, and the response to the Enlightenment, and certainly the Jewish Enlightenment, what we call the Haskalah, was varied in the various countries. Eastern Europe didn't respond the way Western Europe did, and the Sfaradim of the West didn't respond the way that the Ashkenazim of the West did. But for all intents and purposes, it did not touch the Jews of the East nearly as much and nearly as impactful as it did the Jews of the West. Now, there were Hachamim that were aware of, the thoughts of enlightenment. There were Hachamim that were very sensitive. Rabbi Israel Moshe Hazan, Eliyahu ben Amozeg, and these Hachamim, they were definitely sensitive to the thoughts that were being raised in the enlightened period in the Haskalah. But it was not a full societal shift. It was not a massive shift of paradigm in the way that it was in the West. And when you take into account that for the most part, the Jews in the West, the Ashkenazi Jews in the West, were living very much in ghettoized situations, the thrust to engage in society, in the reforms of society, in the shattering, for all intents and purposes, of the medieval thought and paradigm of the nature of reality, and where religion itself was being turned on its head and undermined and compromised, the shock of the Enlightenment was immense. And so when you have that situation going on in the West, which is slightly touching the East, but in no way to the magnitude that it is in the West, what ends up happening is that you have a massive shift in where the Jews of the West are having to deal with this massive shattering of paradigm to be able to gather themselves and work on how it is that they are going to deal with this and respond. And you have everything from Reform Judaism to Hasidism that is going on as a response of this. And, the Jews in the East, for all intents and purposes, are carrying on as they always have. But you can see that there is a difference in terms of the issues that are being written about, the thought that is being, that people are dealing with, and the way that the general Hachamim of the East are thinking after the 18th century and the 19th century. And so there is a shock of sorts when the Eastern Jews need to start moving into the West. And you have Sephardi Jews coming into America, even Sephardi Jews that are having to deal with the establishment of the state of Israel by Ashkenazim. And what does one do when one finds oneself in Western culture, and for all intents and purposes, a post-Enlightenment Western culture, in which the mode of life, the way of engaging in the world is pronounced and very different than one is used to in the East? I believe, and I recognize that this is in broad strokes, and I was telling Professor Perelis I'd be very interested in his thoughts around this. But the question has been raised many times. Why is it that the Sephardic Jews of the Middle East seemed to fall in line with the Ashkenazi Jews with whom they found themselves? We find that the Sfaradim, for all intents and purposes, went to Ashkenazi yeshivot. We find that the Sfaradim, there was a tremendous lacking in terms of education as far as Torah was concerned. Jewish day schools, that the way that things were going on in the United States, Sephardic, young people were not being encouraged to become teachers, to become rabbis, and because of that, the Ashkenazi approach to Judaism became very predominant. I believe that there was a feeling of self-consciousness among Sephardim. There was a feeling of self-consciousness among the Sephardim that lived in the West, that had to move into the West with the Ashkenazim. I don't know that there was a self-consciousness among the first generation, but around the second and third generation, there was a feeling that we were the minority, and that for all intents and purposes, when I say we, I mean we, the Middle Eastern Sephardim, were the minority, and that for all intents and purposes, we really didn't know how to be Jewish. I certainly felt that even as I was growing up. I grew up in the 70s and 80s in Los Angeles, and I realized that nobody had any idea as to the nature of Jewish practice that I was so used to at home, but was not practiced or recognized as even valid among the Ashkenazim with whom I was living and growing up. I mean, examples of this are, first of all, one example is just the kippah. I mean, the Sfaradim, certainly, in the Syrian community, never walked around with kippot. The religious ones, the most religious one. I mean, my grandfather, my father's father, was one of the most pious men that I have ever known. I mean, he letter of the law. He was always studying, always studying. He was one of the first 10 people in synagogue, wore tzitzit, practiced taharat mishpacha, back in the old days. Yeah. And yet walked around without a kippah all the time. And I knew rabbis walked around without a kippah. My father, alav shalom, he used to study with Chacham Matlub Abadi. Chacham Matlub Abadi was one of the great Chachamim of, one of the last Chachamim of Halab, but he lived in New York in the Syrian community and died in the 60s, unfortunately, relatively young. But a massive Talmid Chacham. My father, and he used to work. Yeah, he went to work in the morning. He didn't have an official rabbinic position, but my father, who used to drive him to work in the morning very often, said that Rabbi, Chacham Matlub would, as they called him, would take his kippah off, put it in his pocket, get into the car, and say, "Okay, let's go." And we're talking about, a posek. This was not, just some average, what they call over here a reverend. Yeah, this was a proper Talmid Chacham. And it wasn't done. And, in the environments in which I grew up, among the Ashkenazim who were Orthodox, what we would call Shomer Torah Mitzvot, not wearing a kippah was tantamount to being irreligious. I mean, God forbid one should be caught without one. And, and other things of that nature. And so there was a feeling of self-consciousness and of being a minority, and, a feeling that our way of Judaism wasn't necessarily recognized as valid. I think some of that had to do with the fact that the Middle Eastern Jews didn't really experience the Enlightenment and didn't live in a world that the Ashkenazim for quite some time already had become very used to. They didn't really know how to live in the West. And they didn't think about their Torah in Western terms or in terms that the Ashkenazim had been used to thinking. And because of that, I think they turned to the Ashkenazim to guide them. Consciously, subconsciously, unconsciously, they turned to their Western brothers and sisters in order to guide them, and perhaps for them to feel a little bit more belonging and accepted. And it's unfortunate that the Ashkenazim didn't recognize the uniqueness of the Middle Eastern Jews and their differences that were completely valid. But that's part of human nature, and that the things that are not clear to us, that are not familiar to us, we tend to be quite protective and defensive of and look at them as other. But I do think that there was one group of Western Jews that were very quiet, carried on, in a very low key way. Maybe part of it is because they were British, but that had a very different way of living in the West than the Ashkenazim did. And it would have been, I think, meaningful if they were heard more, if they were recognized more. And those are the Western Sfaradim that, for all intents and purposes, went from Spain to Portugal to Amsterdam to England. The first Jews in England, after Jews had been expelled from England by Edward I in the 13th century, there had not been essentially a Jew living in England in any public way, in any self aware way, until the 17th century. And the first Jews to come back to England in the 17th century, specifically 1656, were the Spanish and Portuguese, first the Portuguese Jews from Portugal, then the Spanish Jews, but they were essentially the Spanish and Portuguese Jews from Amsterdam. And Menashe ben Israel, who was a Rav of the Sephardi community in Amsterdam, came with Hacham Yaakov Sasportas in 1655 and petitioned Oliver Cromwell to allow the Jews to resettle in England. And they were essentially allowed. There was a question whether it was formally allowed or not, but they were essentially allowed to come in, and there was an allowance for them to be able to establish themselves as a congregation without having to live incognito. And so they did in 1656. And the Sfaradim came, and they were the first Jews in this country. I say that, the first synagogue that they built formally is in the City of London. The City of London, for those who are not familiar, is not the whole City of London. The City of London proper is 1 square mile, which is essentially old London. And they built a synagogue on Bevis Marks Street there in 1701. And that, I say, is the cradle of British Jewry, because it was the first synagogue built. Thankfully, it is still standing and still used, has not closed its doors since 1701. The first Hacham of that synagogue was Hacham David Nieto, my predecessor, the author of Matei Dan, who was born in Italy and was brought in to become the Hacham here in London. He was a polymath. He was not only a tremendous Talmid Hacham, but he was a tremendously enlightened scholar and a doctor, for that matter. And he wrote a great deal. He wrote prolifically, and engaged with the Archbishop of Canterbury when he was here, engaged in sciences and so on. There was something special about these Jews. They were Jews that lived in the West, Jews that experienced the Enlightenment, but because they had always been engaged with the society around them, didn't really live secluded lives. The Enlightenment was more of a tremor for them rather than a rupture or shattering of paradigm. They were used to being in the world. They were used to the development and flow of where it was that things went. And also, because of that, the Sfaradim in general always accepted and embraced all members of the Kahal, all members of the community, regardless of the levels of their observance. They recognized them all as members of the Kahal. What was unique about the Sfaradim is that they recognized that there were standards, and that the Hachamim were respected, and that the standards of halakha, of Jewish law, were respected and established. And that they recognized was the authority, and that's what they wanted. They wanted for the Hacham to be of high caliber. They wanted the Hacham, and when I say high caliber, they wanted him to have classical knowledge of Jewish law, Jewish thought, and for him to lead and guide the community that way, regardless of whether the individuals in the community were of the highest level of observance or not. But the standards were always of traditional halakha. And I think that, the Western Sfaradim are unique in all the world. And when I call it a confluence of culture, which I think was, part of the title of this talk and sharing, I'm talking about the confluence of culture between Spanish mentality, the Spanish Jewish mentality of integration and embracing of the world and society, and working in society, cultivating society, being part of the fabric of the general society, as well as um, being in the West, right? So all of the Sfaradim had that idea, right? All of the Sfaradim had integration in society, lived within the culture within which they found themselves, even in the Middle East. But these were Sephardim that were living in the West and had been living in the West for over 500 years. And so there is something special about them because there was almost something that was steady and unbreaking about them. They didn't have the shatterings of Jews that came out of the ghetto and having to live and negotiate how it is that we were going to do modern Judaism. For the Sfaradim, there was no such thing as modern Judaism. It was simply Judaism and its development over time in terms of our responsiveness to the way the world was moving. The Sfaradim always saw the world as an expression of God and its movement as the movement of God's guidance and development in history. And so it was always a question of our responsiveness to that, of understanding the principles of Torah, of Judaism and Jewish thought, and how it is that they should be applied in the development of time and the changes that came with the development of time. We saw that indeed as the nature of our covenant with God, that our part is in order to be able to take the principles of Torah that God gave us and to engage them into present society. It has always been the case for the Sfaradim, always been the case in terms of how it is that we've acted. But for the Sfaradim that did experience the Enlightenment, the Sfaradim that did live, not only the scholars and not only the rabbis, but the entirety of the society, of the Jewish community had to experience and deal with it, they carried on. And I think that it's also important to recognize that it is unique in Britain because the major disruptor to the continuity of Jewish life, of course, in Europe and in the West was the Holocaust. And the British Jews were very lucky that the horrors of the Holocaust did not reach the British Islands, and they defended against it. And what that meant was that the Jews of this country lived as Jews in their Jewish life, uninterrupted, certainly of my community, for over 10 generations. And that's really unheard of when you think about it. I mean, who can say that today? Who can say that today? I mean, I have people in my community who genuinely know they can trace right back. And as early as there's photographs, we have photographs. And certainly we have the records. We keep meticulous records in our community here in London, that they can say that they know that their great grandparents were married at Bevis Mark Synagogue, which is just 40 minutes away from here. And for those of you who will visit London, it would be my honor and pleasure to give you a tour of the synagogue. I highly recommend it. It's still lit by candles till this day. All of the furnitures and furnishings are the original 1701 models. That's really remarkable when you think about it. And it's not just because they didn't get the calamities or experience the calamities that other Jews in Europe did. It's a feat in and of itself to hold yourself as a community faithful to your Judaism for over 350 years without cessation. That's something that's pretty significant. And so there's something about the way that the Western Sfaradim relate to the world, to their Judaism, its malleability, its pliability, its pragmatism, its sensitivity to reality, to the human condition, to the practicalities of human life and society. Those elements, I believe, were in no small part responsible for me having a community to still be a senior rabbi of today. So I believe that it can be a tremendous offering. It could be a valuable strand of Jewish way, of Jewish life, of Jewish thought, of moderation, of humanism, of pragmatism, of honor, of respect that has been practiced by my community for over 400 years, that can be meaningful to the whole of Jewry, of world Jewry. I believe that there's something to learn from the Western Sfaradim on that bent. And it's not to say that the Spanish and Portuguese Jews don't have strong convictions about things and strong reproaches things. I mean, Hacham Sasportas, who was the first Hacham, was only here for 2 years because he left once the plague started here in London. But he's very famous in that he was a staunch and vehement opponent of Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah. When the whole Jewish world was falling hook, line, and sinker for Shabtai Tzvi, Hacham Sasportas stood very firmly against it. And that also, I believe, is a strong merit for the community, both spiritually, but even practically. One of the things that he established in the community here and in Amsterdam, he wasn't the only one who established it in Amsterdam. Chacham Shaul Mortera was also responsible for it. But one of the strong things that he established was no Kabbalah. What I mean by no Kabbalah is not that Kabbalah couldn't be studied. Of course, people could study. He himself, Chacham Sasportas, was a Mekubal. He studied Kabbalah. But he refused to allow Kabbalah to manifest in our law and practice. So that is a very marked difference between the Western Sfaradim and the Eastern Sfaradim. The Eastern Sfaradim, after the 16th and 17th century, their liturgy tremendously changed because of the influence of Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari, otherwise known as the Ari, and his student Rabbi Chaim Vital. And their writings were tremendously infiltrated the Sidur, the prayers, and the practices and customs as to how it is that Sfaradim and Edot HaMizrach, Eastern communities, do things. And the Western Sfaradim never adjusted to that. We never took that on. And one of the reasons was because of Hacham Sasportas. He was concerned because Shabtai Tzvi used Kabbalah tremendously in order to be able to get people to follow on his bandwagon. So Hacham Sasportas didn't allow that here. And I think that that's also extremely important, an extremely valuable element of our longevity, and something that also I think should be considered for the broader Jewish world. Because what Kabbalah did was it made people, unfortunately, and I'm not saying that Kabbalah inherently does this, I think that this was a fallout of many communities who took on Kabbalah, specifically the laymen, without sensitivity to its appropriate application. It made reason further and further relegated to the sidelines, and people followed only Kabbalistic ideas and spiritual ideas without learning how to ground them into the practical elements of everyday life. And because of that, there was a tremendous disconnect between everyday life and the practices of our Judaism. But that was not the case in the Western Sephardi society and culture. Often I say that you can look in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, and see what it is that a synagogue is supposed to look like and act like, and how services are supposed to be held, and what the structures are, and you can essentially see it practiced word for word in a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. You cannot see it practiced that way in a Middle Eastern Sephardi synagogue that was highly influenced by Kabbalah. Yeah, so for example, you can read the Rambam, you can read the Mishneh Torah and the halachot of tefillah and how tefillah is supposed to run, and you can see it manifest in the practices of the Western Sephardi services. You don't find it practiced in that way in the Eastern Sephardi services, and that's because of the great influence of Kabbalistic thought and ideas in the practical behaviors and actions. So in summation, I want to be able to give time for questions. What do I believe the Western Sfaradim, the confluence of culture of Spanish approach to Judaism and Western society and thought can bring to the modern Jewish world? The modern Jewish world is very strongly Western right now. The state of Israel itself, America, certainly Britain, the major centers are very strongly influenced by Western thought, Western mores, Western philosophy. And And for the most part, the Ashkenazim, who have lived in the West for over 1,000 years, are predominant in their way, in their approach of dealing with that. But there is another approach. I think that the Western Sephardi approach, one of pragmatism, humanism, embracing the world and society, investing in the world and society, not seeing the world as an elaborate distraction, but rather seeing the world as an elaborate expression of God, and through that coming to know God, is much needed in Judaism, always has been, and certainly today all the more so. And I think that the Western Sfaradim have been doing it for over 3 centuries, and it's something that we can learn from and grow to experience in our modern lives in a way that is robust, deep, meaningful, and with tremendous value. And so with that, I'll open for if anybody has any questions. But that's just my broad strokes take on current things.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Alan Harris has a question. Do you want to ask it? Do you want to open your microphone and ask?
Is this the question down here? The last one?
He
If you'd like to, I mean, it's fine.
No, he's right here. So.
Okay. Alan?
No,
Yes.
we don't hear you. Yes. Did you want to ask your question?
Yes. First of all, excuse me, very much enjoyed your presentation. And I'm an Ashkenazi, just by way of background. I went to Yeshivat Chochmei Tzofat in France, Yeshiva Vextebain, and through that experience many years ago with Mizrahi Sephardim, if I may use that term, basically from North Africa and so on. And I was just wondering, always surprised that Ashkenazim kind of had a somewhat of a condescendent kind of attitude towards the Sephardim, despite the fact, the overwhelming evidence of the massive contribution of the Sephardi Chachamim, both to Talmud, but particularly to Halacha, that actually the Ashkenazim follow, namely the Rambam and Yosef Karo. So I'm dumbfounded as to why there is this kind of condescendence, so to speak. It seems that the Western Sfaradim have weathered that better than the Middle Eastern. And I wonder in some way, because I was unaware of the role of Kabbalah, that whether the Ashkenazim, that basically is kind of anathema to a lot of them to even consider studying, and I say studying Kabbalah.
Well, it depends which Ashkenazi.
That kind of in a way justifies, because I'm trying to find a justification to the Ashkenazi condescendent kind of attitude. Sorry about this long.
I mean, I appreciate the question. You know, justification, I don't know, but I think that if I were to offer and I will say it's, you know, I'm going to say it's a superficial explanation, right? Because I'm sure that it is, I'm confident that it is much more nuanced than I would suggest here. But I think the roots of it, the core roots of it, are 2 things. One, it's basic humanity. Yeah, there is condescension anytime that one sees someone who is different than oneself, but nonetheless in close proximity to oneself, right? And so for the Ashkenazim, when they saw the Sfaradim of certainly of the East, it was so foreign to them, the way that they spoke, the way that they dressed, the way that they thought, the way that they engaged in their own Judaism, right? Right or wrong. It's not a matter of right or wrong. It's just a matter of the fact that it was so different to them. And that, you know, I think it's important for us to recognize we don't realize today consciously how segregated the Jewish people were for 1,000 years. Yeah, I mean, how completely isolated the Jewish people were for 1,000 years. And when I say isolated, I'm not talking about the Jews of Aleppo and the Jews of Poland. I'm talking about the Jews of Aleppo and the Jews of Damascus. I'm talking about the Jews of Hungary and the Jews of France. I mean, there was massive differences between the two. I mean, till very, very recently, and I still think there are problems with this, Jews from Aleppo wouldn't even marry Jews from Damascus. It's the same country. They wouldn't marry. They didn't let their children play with each other when they moved to New York and they found themselves next door neighbors with each other. So I think that's one thing to recognize. We all, right, are used to living next door to Jews that, 100 years ago never would have seen each other, never would have interacted. And if they did, would not have recognized each other as being significant Jews, for all intents and purposes. So that's the first thing. So what the condescension of which you're speaking, on whatever levels it happened, is part of human nature. Certainly when you have the numbers, there were more Ashkenazim than there were Sfaradim in many areas. I think that in England, there was a difference in England. The difference was that the Sfaradim in England were the establishment, which is the rarest of things. But the Sfaradim of England were the establishment. They considered themselves and everyone related to them as the aristocrats of Anglo Jewry, because they were here 100 years before the Ashkenazim even came onto the shores. And so they started everything. They began everything. They were at the foundational elements of everything. And they established Judaism in this country. I believe that the way that the Ashkenazim are with their Judaism here, I'm not going to go into details, but it was profoundly influenced by the Spanish and Portuguese Jews here. So I think that it's, first of all, the normal relationship that human beings have with each other. And when you find somebody that's in close proximity, but different, right? Trying to be part of your club, but doesn't look like the members of your club. The most natural thing to do is to condescend. And there is this concern, even the rabbis, on a subconscious level. I know that I hold authority with my people. Will I hold authority with your people? And if I don't hold authority with your people, well, then I'll have to show why your people, are not either worthy of my authority or not, ones that we recognize, and so on and so forth. But it's nothing new, right? That phenomenon in humanity is not something that's new.
I appreciate that, but just part of my question, which was really the most important in my mind, is that from a halachic, cultural, Jewish standpoint, the contribution of the Sephardi Chachamim throughout the centuries is far superior to that of the Ashkenazim, yet the Ashkenazim starting in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, particularly with the Litvaks and so on, that really consider that Litvak is royalty and everything else is secondary, but the whole world basically adheres to Yosef Karo and the Rambam. So to me, I understand the proximity and so on, but if we're talking about the intelligentsia in the Jewish Orthodox world, and I'm not talking about the Haredi world now, I'm talking about the Jewish Orthodox, and a typical example is Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, that was recognized, but for one Rabbi Ovadia Yosef recognized by the Ashkenazim, how many were ignored?
Yeah, so I think that we have to qualify what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, and when you're talking about Harambam, first of all, Harambam was far enough away historically from Ashkenazic Jewry and the Litvaks that you're talking about, so that they didn't even register that this man was what we would call, quote unquote, a Sfaradi. There's no doubt that if they saw the man and they heard the man speak, they would recognize that they don't know this person and that they maybe shouldn't listen to him. But what did they have? They had text, right? And all the Rambam was doing was restating the law of the Talmud, which was remarkable work. Who's done that and who could have done that? So yes, there was one Sephardi, who did this tremendous work and who everybody realizes now. And even the Rambam wrote, by the way, in his lifetime. In his lifetime, he wasn't accepted the way that we accept him now. And he writes to a student who was, very upset about the fact that, he wasn't accepted in the way that he felt he should be accepted. And Harambam says to him, he goes, look, that's only because they're jealous. And soon everybody will die. And when everybody dies, you'll see that I wrote a good book. Essentially, what is that Harambam said to a student? Literally. I'm very minorly paraphrasing, but essentially what is that he said to a student, right? So and that point is an important point, because Harambam is making the point that I'm essentially pointing out to you, that these are very fundamental primal human psychological responses to difference and other. So Harambam was far enough removed so that they didn't have to be threatened by him and the difference of his thought, not to mention the fact that they were very happy reading the Mishneh Torah, not very happy reading the Moreh Nebuchim. Yeah, because that was a whole aspect of Harambam that they did not like and were not interested in. And they went so far as to say, we're not so sure if he actually wrote those two books, the same man. There were people that went so far as to say that. Yeah. And these are, very similar to the people who say, we're not so sure it was the same God who created the world and gave us the Torah. So it's very important to recognize that I believe, again, it is fundamentally entrenched in human psychology and primal human responses to other and to difference. And even Maran Shulchan Aruch, when you're talking about Rabbi Yosef Karo, they recognize, they use it as a template, right? Because it's an easy template to use, but they don't rule like him. Yeah, they don't rule like him. And when you talk about Hacham Ovadia Yosef, frankly, Hacham Ovadia Yosef, you are looking at him after the 90 years of his life. But for the majority of his life, he was on the outskirts. He was rejected by the establishment and by the rabbis. They burned his books. Iraqi Jews burned his books, not even the Ashkenazim. And then he was cholek on the Chazon Ish. I always say he was cholek on the Ben Ish Chai, right? Hacham Ovadia was argued on the Ben Ish Chai. He argued on the Ben Ish Chai. The entire Iraqi community blackballed him. From the time
that you off a little bit, sorry. Because I want to make sure we get to other questions. And because
I'll finish this line and we'll go to the other questions. But you got me started, Ellen. I'm sorry. Yeah, but Hacham Ovadia, he was blackballed by the Iraqi Jews. And so he was accepted by the Ashkenazim until he argued on the Chazon Ish. And when he argued on the Chazon Ish, they blackballed him. And you have, so there, it's not so pashut, right? It's quite, yeah. So, I appreciate the point, but I think that all of it goes back to primal, basic human instincts in psychology. I apologize for going on that answer. But.
No, it's okay. And I also want to say, because Professor Tzvi Zohar is going to be joining us next month, and that's a lot of what he talks about, the difference there. So I just want to make sure. Ellen Oslik had a question.
Yes.
I could just paraphrase, because you had mentioned it before about the accepting the other, and you being a Syrian in a Western Sephardi, and like you said, in Sheretz Israel, you have Rav Soloveitchik, and the question of, is there going to be a new leadership? I know your Chabura does that, and you can mention that as well, but is there a way to reinvigorate the Western Sephardi leadership?
Well, I appreciate the question. I mean, for me, what I'm working on is the Chabura is part of it. I mean, for those who don't know, the Chabura is an online learning platform that essentially it aims to teach the framework of classical Sephardi thought and approach. And I'm taking advantage of the internet because it's international, so anybody could log on to this. And I think that if people spend enough time on the classes that are being given, Rav Tzvi Zohar, he's a regular contributor to the Chabura, as an example. I see here Rav Eli Shaubi, who's also a regular contributor on the Chabura, and he's a tremendous asset to the Chabura, a tremendous Talmid Chacham. That for me is the way that I think is lucrative to do it, because we should take advantage of the fact that we have a platform that allows us to communicate with Jews like you're seeing from all over the world, as we see here, on the platform today, and to be able to network people all over the world who can educate in that fashion. I believe deeply in my heart that education is the core answer to these issues. And the more that we can educate, the more that people know, the more they build a framework and lens through which to be able to see these things and think on these things. And the more that we empower people with the sources, with the actual, texts and ideas that bring this out, the stronger it becomes. So that's what I'm trying to, in my own small way, trying to do to be able to help this.
Okay, Dr. Konadad?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Sephardim in America.
Yeah.
Because they came also very early. okay? Basically by accident somehow with the 23 first a long time ago. And there's a book that's really good that I read a long time ago that's called The Grandees.
Yes,
And really
you have it.
explain how those were the aristocrats, the nobles. And when 2 centuries later, these peasants, Ashkenazi, coming there, they looked at them from far above. I mean, they were the bottom of the bottom. They didn't have any education. I remember vividly the story about this man in the book, Daniels, who was taking care of, a tanner, I don't know how to say that in English, but anyway, taking care of furs and stuff like that. And he was teaching this young guy coming from the Europe, and he suddenly saw this guy eating and cleaning himself on his pants, and he said, "That's it, out, fired."
Yeah.
And this was later on Astor, the Astor family.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that there was this thing happening there, and they really built themselves up. And the Ashkenazis came really 200 years later. So it's the same thing that you have in England that you also have in United States. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is there's something that struck me a lot in Italy, near Venice, in the Lido Island, where they had this old Jewish cemetery, which has basically 14 levels of tombs. And when you look at those tombs, they are absolutely gorgeous. They have sculptures, all of them. And in fact, they interested a lot the French non-Jews, intellectuals, a century ago. Georges Sand and de Musset went there, and others went there to this cemetery. And when you look at it, it's really shows a very, very high degree, I think, of, elegance and things like that. Something that was a little bit out of the ordinary for Jews when we look at cemeteries in general. But that shows exactly what you said, how they were basically so integrated, mixed up with the rest of the people, and how all this enlightenment was being carried on, and showing even in the way the tombs were built up and things like that. So I think that there's so much that to be said about this, and really to talk about this part of the Sephardic Jews situation. And also I wanted to point one thing is, for example, in Algeria, in North Africa, you had the Jews that came from Spain, and they also thought of themselves a lot. And you had the Jews that came from the South, who were very high chachams, and they were having a different way of saying. They were very, in a religious way, they were very a different thing, but they were all very highly spiritual people. Nevertheless, when people started mixing up and and marrying each other within the family, one will look at the other, from above. So there is all those different things going on, and I think there's so much that we can be enriched of by learning for all those different way of life and being, and I think. One more thing I was thinking about is in terms of
if you can make it short, we just want to make sure if there are any other
I
questions.
just wanted to just put the name of Spinoza as an important name for different aspect of things that we've talked about.
Well,
Maybe
I'll say one thing about
clear.
Spinoza, which people don't necessarily know, that I am formally still restricted from speaking about Spinoza from the pulpit, because he's been put into cherem by the Amsterdam rabbinate and accepted by the London, Sfaradim, and so that's never been rescinded. But nonetheless, this is a little fact. Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Adar.
Thank you. I don't see any. Oh, I'm sorry, Kara?
Can I just add to
Wait,
what?
I want to make sure Kara has a chance to
Sorry,
ask.
excuse
Sorry,
me.
just because
Okay.
we're over time already, but I do want to make sure that you're on mute though, Kara.
Okay, yes, thank you. So my comment is in reference to Maimonides and Convivencia in the context of contemporary political activism, specifically as Sephardim, I guess in this case, both Western and Eastern, when we're looking at Convivencia as a model, perhaps that we can use challenges around how we're defining difference. And Maimonides, who is one of the few philosophers who spoke about anthropocentrism, and how can we, or maybe not how, but I implore us as Sephardic scholars to see Maimonides' position as one that does embrace empathy and an interspecial sense of, for example, Rabbi Dweck, what you said about sensitivity and pragmatism, that we can use Maimonides' philosophies that do contradict anthropocentrism in a modern context, in a modern political framing of ecological issues in relation to our confluence, our hybridized identities. And Ladino, for example, is a beautiful example of this kind of hybridized linguistic reality. And so I want to just highlight that we're in a phenomenal position, I think, in 2021 and for us to refer back to Maimonides as a model and Convivencia also. So if you have any reflections on that, I'd love to hear.
I appreciate that, and I look. I mean, I can say that Harambam was certainly a sensitive, empathic man, and we know that not only from his formal writings. I think that one of the most beautiful things that we have from Harambam are his letters, much of which we found in the Cairo Geniza, but we have a huge amount of his personal writings, and there's a certain side of him that comes out in those writings that we don't necessarily see in the formal works as prominently or as explicitly. I'll say two things. I think that one must be cautious to take the thought of somebody as prominent and prolific as Harambam is one of the things that's enticing to us, because he was prolific. There's nothing about Torah that he didn't write. There's nothing in Judaism that he didn't write about, essentially. And there's a tendency because of that to be able to apply him in all places, in all areas, almost as we wish. I think that as scholars, we need to be rigorous about that. We have to be careful about applying Maimonides or anything, any scholarship for that matter, as we wish it, if it is not necessarily appropriately attributed given the context of how it is that Maimonides wrote or meant certain things. That said, there's no question in my mind that Harambam was a profoundly empathic and sensitive man and Rav, right? And Hacham. And there is much in his writings that we can indeed draw from and understand and recognize, to apply to our own responsibilities in modern times for that same type of sensitivity and empathy. Yeah, I'll leave that.
Thank you. And I try not to go over, so I do want to allow people to leave, but I do say thank you. If you have follow-up, and we can try to continue the conversation in another session or another time. So thank you, Rabbi Dweck, and thank you all for joining.
It's an honor.
I do want to point out, just because I have to, and this is part of a full 2-week session, and so we hope to see you at the further ones. Actually, Professor Tzvi Zohar, who was the one I mentioned before, is not part of this. He'll be part of our Egypt kind of week and a half session. So that'll be the beginning of May. But we do hope to see you at future events, and Rabbi Dweck, we hope to see you as well.
Thank
I
you,
will send a
Anna.
follow-up
Thank you
email
for
with the
having
rest
me.
of it.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry?
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Likewise.
Exactly.
Thank you all for joining.
And everybody have a wonderful Wednesday, as Rabbi Dweck said. Bye.